This map is lying to you. For most of human history, these lines didn't exist. Rome was not Italy. Egypt was not a country. People didn't cross borders. Borders hadn't been invented yet. This is how the old world actually worked. When we look at the world today, we see lines everywhere. Borders divide continents into countries, each marked with a different color on a map. These lines feel permanent, natural, almost inevitable. But for most of human history, this way of seeing the world did not exist. In the ancient world, people did not live inside countries. They did not think in terms of national borders, passports, or fixed territories. Instead, they understood the world through cities, communities, trade networks, and shared customs. Belonging was not defined by lines on a map, but by relationships and connections. To say, "I am Roman," did not mean that someone lived inside a clearly defined Roman country. It meant that they followed Roman law, used Roman roads, traded in Roman markets, and were protected by Roman authority. Roman influence faded gradually, not suddenly at a border. One village might feel Roman, the next only partially so, and beyond that, not at all. The same was true in the Greek world. Being Greek was not about political borders. It was about language, shared stories, common gods, and cultural practices. A merchant from Athens could travel to another city, be recognized as culturally familiar, and still remain an outsider in local politics, without ever crossing a border. What truly shaped the ancient world were paths, not lines. Roads, rivers, coastlines, and caravan routes connected people across vast distances. These routes allowed ideas, goods, and customs to move freely. The world was organized by movement, not containment. Danger did exist, but it was not defined by borders. Travelers feared storms, bandits, disease, or hostile terrain, not paperwork or guards. Freedom of movement was normal, even if it was difficult and risky. To understand the ancient world, we must unlearn the modern habit of seeing history through borders. The past was not divided into countries. It was a continuous landscape of cities, routes, and human interaction. This story begins in that world, a world without lines. Before modern borders existed, people did not ask the question, "Which country are you from?" That question would have made little sense in the ancient world. Instead, people asked different questions, questions that revealed how belonging actually worked. A person was first identified by their city. Cities were not just places to live, they were centers of law, worship, trade, and protection. Saying, "I am from Alexandria," or "I belong to Carthage," immediately explained how someone lived, what language they spoke, and which customs shaped their daily life. Beyond cities, community and profession mattered deeply. Farmers, sailors, craftsmen, soldiers, and merchants formed identities around their roles rather than territory. A trader traveling across regions remained recognizable not because of a passport, but because of shared methods, tools, and trade languages understood along major routes. Language itself was one of the strongest markers of belonging. In the ancient Mediterranean, many people spoke more than one language. Greek functioned as a common tongue across vast areas, allowing people from different regions to communicate without sharing political allegiance. This created a cultural network that extended far beyond any single city or ruler. Religion also connected people across space. Worship of shared gods created familiarity between strangers. Temples dedicated to the same deity could be found hundreds of miles apart, offering travelers a sense of recognition and safety. These sacred spaces were not national institutions, they were part of a shared cultural world. Law, when it mattered, followed people rather than territory. Roman citizenship, for example, was portable. A Roman citizen carried legal status with them, even far from Rome itself. This idea, that identity could move with a person, shaped how the ancient world functioned. Because belonging was flexible, movement was common. People migrated for work, trade, marriage, or opportunity. Over time, entire populations blended, adapted, and reshaped local cultures. The ancient world was not static, It was constantly reorganizing itself through human movement. In this world, identity was layered. A person could belong to a city, speak multiple languages, worship shared gods, and trade across continents, all at once. Borders were unnecessary because belonging was not confined to a single place. In a world without borders, danger did not disappear. It simply took a different form. Travelers in the ancient world were not stopped by guards or paperwork, but by distance, nature, and uncertainty. The greatest threat was geography itself. Mountains slowed movement, deserts drained strength, and seas changed without warning. Storms could destroy ships long before they reached land. Rivers flooded unexpectedly, turning familiar routes into obstacles. These dangers were constant and unavoidable, shaping how and when people traveled. Human threats also existed, but they were not defined by territory. Bandits targeted isolated travelers, not because they had crossed a border, but because they were vulnerable. Protection came from traveling in groups, choosing well-known routes, and stopping at established towns. Safety was created through reputation and predictability, not state control. Disease was another silent danger. Without modern medicine, travelers carried illnesses unknowingly from one place to another. Port cities, crossroads, and market towns became points of exposure. Yet even this risk did not stop movement. Instead, societies adapted. Travelers learned which seasons were safer, which routes avoided outbreaks, and which communities offered shelter during illness. Importantly, fear did not come from crossing into foreign land. Most people expected cultural difference. Languages changed gradually, customs shifted slowly, and travelers adjusted as they moved. The ancient world was experienced as a continuum, not a series of separated zones. To manage risk, people relied on shared knowledge. Maps were rare, but stories were common. Information about safe paths, dangerous regions, and trustworthy towns traveled faster than goods. Inns and temples served as information hubs where travelers exchanged news. Powerful states did not enforce borders to control danger. Instead, they invested in roads, ports, and patrols that kept movement possible. Stability came from maintaining circulation, not stopping it. This balance, between freedom and risk, defined life before borders. Movement was normal, danger was expected, and adaptation was essential. The ancient traveler accepted uncertainty as part of the journey, knowing that the world remained open, even when it was difficult. Trade was the true engine of the old world. Long before borders existed, goods moved across continents with remarkable consistency. Not because of political agreements, but because demand created its own pathways. In the ancient world, trade did not belong to states. It belonged to networks. Merchants rarely traveled from one end of the world to the other. Instead, goods passed from hand to hand, moving gradually across regions. A trader in Central Asia did not need to know Rome to trade with Rome. They only needed to know the next market, the next town, the next caravan. This system created a layered economy. Local markets handled daily needs, while long-distance trade moved luxury items, spices, silk, metals, dyes, and rare stones. These goods carried more than value. They carried information. When a product arrived, it brought news of distant lands, changing tastes, and shifting demand. Ports played a crucial role. Coastal cities became meeting points where cultures overlapped. Ships arrived from different directions, unloading cargo that would immediately begin a new journey inland. These cities were not border towns. They were exchange zones, where movement was expected and diversity was normal. Standardization emerged naturally. Weights, measures, and coin designs became familiar across wide regions. Merchants trusted systems they recognized, not flags or rulers. Reputation mattered more than origin. A known trader was welcomed, regardless of where they came from. Trade also shaped daily life. Diets changed as new foods arrived. Clothing reflected imported materials. Tools improved as techniques spread. Entire regions adapted their economies around routes that had existed for generations. Importantly, trade did not require control through borders. When trade slowed, it was usually because routes became unsafe or infrastructure collapsed, not because access was restricted. Power in the ancient world meant keeping routes open, not closing them. The old world functioned as a connected web, not a collection of isolated zones. Trade created continuity across distance, binding societies together without the need for formal boundaries. Understanding this network is essential. It explains why the ancient world remained stable for long periods, even without borders. Movement was not chaos, it was structure. In the modern world, power is often imagined as control over territory. Borders define where authority begins and ends. In the ancient world, power worked differently. It was not fixed to lines on a map. It was measured by reach, presence, and reliability. Ancient states focused on maintaining influence, not enclosing land. Control extended outward from cities through roads, ports, and alliances. Where these systems functioned, authority was felt. Where they broke down, it faded, gradually, not suddenly. There was no moment where one stepped from order into disorder. The transition was slow and often barely noticeable. Rome offers a clear example. Roman power did not depend on marking borders but on keeping infrastructure intact. Roads allowed officials, soldiers, and information to move quickly. Ports ensured supplies reached cities. Law followed citizens rather than staying confined to territory. If these systems worked, Rome remained present. If they failed, Roman influence weakened without any line being crossed. Other powers operated similarly. Empires rose by securing routes, not walls. Control over key cities mattered more than control over empty land. A strategic port or crossroads could shape entire regions, while vast areas beyond remained loosely connected or largely independent. This approach required constant maintenance. Authority was not assumed, it was demonstrated. Roads had to be repaired, markets protected, and alliances renewed. Power existed where people experienced its benefits, safety, trade, justice, not where it was simply declared. Local autonomy played a major role. Communities governed themselves according to tradition, as long as they remained connected to larger networks. This flexibility allowed stability across diverse cultures. Uniformity was unnecessary. What mattered was participation, not obedience to a central boundary. Because power was relational, not territorial, it could expand and contract smoothly. This made the ancient world adaptable. When conditions changed, climate, trade, population, systems adjusted without the shock that rigid borders often create. Understanding this model challenges modern assumptions. Stability did not require strict division. It required functioning connections. Power was not drawn with ink. It was built, maintained, and experienced through everyday movement. Borders did not appear naturally. They were not an inevitable stage of human organization. They were introduced deliberately, by specific groups, for very specific reasons. The earliest push toward borders came from rulers who needed predictability. As populations grew and economies became more complex, controlling movement became increasingly valuable. Taxation, conscription, and resource management all depended on knowing who belonged where. Kings and emerging states realized that influence alone was no longer enough. Roads and trade networks were powerful, but they were difficult to regulate. A merchant could move freely, carrying wealth beyond the reach of authority. Fixed boundaries offered a solution. By defining territory, rulers could define obligation. Borders allowed states to collect taxes efficiently. Land could be measured, ownership recorded, and production monitored. People became legible to power. Knowing where someone lived meant knowing what they owed. This was impossible in a world defined purely by movement and networks. Military interests also played a role. Standing armies required supply lines, recruitment zones, and clear areas of control. Borders simplified defense planning. Instead of maintaining influence everywhere, states could concentrate resources along defined edges. Religious and ideological control followed closely. As centralized belief systems expanded, borders helped enforce uniformity. Laws, customs, and beliefs could be standardized within controlled spaces. Difference became easier to identify and suppress. Importantly, borders did not immediately reshape everyday life. At first, they existed mostly on paper. Maps were redrawn long before people felt the effects. Farmers continued to cross traditional routes. Traders followed familiar paths. But gradually, enforcement increased. Guards appeared. Permits were introduced. Movement began to require approval. Those who benefited most were centralized authorities, monarchs, bureaucracies, and emerging nation-states. Borders transformed influence into ownership. Land became something to possess, not simply pass through. For ordinary people, this shift was subtle but profound. Freedom of movement narrowed. Identity became tied to territory rather than participation. The world slowly changed from a network of connections into a collection of enclosed spaces. Borders were not created for safety or clarity alone. They were created to control resources, people, and power. When borders first appeared, they did not immediately feel dramatic. There were no walls stretching across continents, no passports demanded at every crossing. At first, borders existed mostly as administrative ideas, quietly reshaping daily life without obvious confrontation. The earliest change was registration. People began to be recorded, where they lived, what land they worked, what they produced. Villages that had once existed as flexible communities were now assigned to jurisdictions. Movement that had once been routine slowly required permission, explanation, or documentation. Markets changed as well. Trade routes that had functioned for centuries began to face restrictions. Certain goods were taxed when entering defined territories. Merchants adjusted their paths, favoring routes that minimized costs and interference. The flow of goods continued, but it became selective rather than open. Language and identity shifted quietly. As authorities emphasized territorial belonging, people were encouraged, sometimes forced, to see themselves as members of a defined space. Dialects were standardized. Local customs were regulated. Over time, difference became less tolerated, not because it disappeared, but because it was easier to label as foreign. Even travel itself changed in tone. Journeys that once felt like gradual transitions began to feel like crossings. Travelers noticed when architecture changed abruptly, when rules differed sharply, when authority asserted itself at specific points. These moments marked the birth of psychological borders, long before physical ones dominated landscapes. Importantly, borders did not remove movement. People continued to migrate, trade, and travel. But movement became conditional. Access replaced participation. Belonging was no longer layered and flexible, it became exclusive. For many, this brought stability. Predictable laws, protected markets, and organized defense improved daily life in certain regions. But this stability came at a cost. Spontaneous interaction declined. Cultural blending slowed. The world became easier to manage, but harder to traverse. Borders reshaped how people understood themselves. Identity shifted from shared activity to assigned location. The ancient web of connections thinned, replaced by controlled channels. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, quietly altering how people lived, worked, and moved, until the bordered world felt normal. As borders slowly moved from ideas into practice, maps began to change their role. In the ancient world, maps were rare and often symbolic. They showed cities, rivers, mountains, and routes. Their purpose was orientation, not control. A map helped travelers understand space, not define ownership. This changed when centralized power expanded. Rulers and administrators needed tools to manage land, people, and resources. Maps became instruments of authority. Lines began to appear, not because the land demanded them, but because governance did. Early bordered maps did not reflect reality on the ground. They reflected intention. A line drawn on parchment signaled a claim, even if villages along that line continued living as they always had. Over time, repeated use gave these lines weight. What started as an abstraction became expectation. Once maps defined territory, policy followed. Taxes were assigned to mapped areas. Military responsibility was calculated by region. Laws were applied unevenly across newly defined spaces. The map began to shape behavior rather than describe it. This process was gradual but decisive. As generations grew up seeing the same lines, the idea of fixed territory became normal. People learned to associate identity with location, even when cultural differences did not align with mapped borders. The world became simpler to administer, but less reflective of lived reality. Importantly, these maps did not eliminate movement. Roads and trade continued. But movement was reframed. Crossing a line gained meaning. It became an act that required justification. The psychological impact was as strong as the physical one. Maps also changed how conflicts were understood. Disputes were no longer about access or influence, but about boundaries. Land became something to defend absolutely, not negotiate fluidly. This shift reshaped diplomacy and warfare for centuries to come. By the time borders were enforced consistently, the idea of a border felt ancient, even though it was not. The world had transitioned from flexible networks to fixed spaces, guided not by nature, but by ink. Understanding this shift helps explain why modern borders feel inevitable, even though they are a recent invention. The map did not just record the world. It redefined it. The appearance of borders changed the world in permanent ways. They brought structure, clarity, and predictability to societies that had once relied on fluid connections. For many people, borders improved daily life. Laws became consistent within defined areas. Defense became organized. Infrastructure could be planned with long-term stability in mind. Fixed territories allowed governments to invest more deeply in specific regions. Roads were maintained regularly, cities expanded safely, and public systems developed. Borders made it possible to coordinate large populations under shared rules, reducing uncertainty for those living within them. But this stability came with trade-offs. As borders hardened, movement became restricted. Routes that had once been open slowed under regulation. Migration, once a normal response to opportunity or hardship, became controlled. Communities that had existed along shared routes found themselves separated by administrative lines. Cultural exchange also changed. Languages that had blended gradually began to separate. Dialects hardened into standardized forms. Traditions that once traveled freely became regional markers. Diversity did not disappear, but it became compartmentalized. The ancient world's flexibility allowed adaptation through movement. When conditions changed, climate shifts, economic disruption, population growth, people adjusted by relocating or reshaping networks. Borders reduced this flexibility. Adaptation now required permission. This shift also altered how conflict worked. Disputes that once involved access or influence became territorial. Land gained symbolic weight. Defending a line became as important as protecting people. Over time, this transformed diplomacy and warfare alike. Yet it is important to recognize that borders did not destroy connection. They reshaped it. Trade continued. Ideas still crossed boundaries. But the flow became narrower, more regulated, and less spontaneous. The modern world inherited both outcomes, the order borders created and the openness they replaced. Understanding the old world before borders is not about rejecting the present. It is about recognizing that another system once existed, one built on movement, connection, and shared space. That system shaped humanity for most of its history. Even after borders began to appear on maps, much of the world still did not function through clear divisions. Instead of bordered states, people lived within regions of influence, wide areas where multiple powers, cultures, and identities overlapped at the same time. In many parts of the ancient world, authority was layered. A city might follow the laws of a distant empire, trade with neighboring cultures, and maintain its own local traditions all at once. This coexistence was normal. Power did not cancel other power, it blended with it. Roman-controlled regions are a good example. Beyond major cities, Roman authority weakened gradually. Local leaders continued to govern daily life. Languages mixed. Customs persisted. A traveler moving through these regions would not experience a sudden shift from Roman to non-Roman. Instead, influence faded step by step. The same pattern existed elsewhere. In ancient China, imperial control spread outward from administrative centers, but vast areas remained semi-autonomous. Nomadic groups, traders, and settlers moved through these regions freely, interacting with multiple systems without belonging fully to any single one. In the Islamic world, space was often understood conceptually rather than territorially. The idea of a shared cultural and legal sphere mattered more than fixed borders. Belonging was defined by participation in a network, not by residence inside a line. These regions functioned because flexibility was built into them. Authority adapted to distance. Control weakened naturally. This prevented abrupt conflict and allowed diverse communities to coexist within shared spaces. For people living in these regions, identity was situational. A person could be a local resident, a trader, a believer, and a subject of a distant ruler, all at the same time. No single label defined them completely. Regions without borders remind us that the world did not immediately become divided once borders were imagined. For centuries, influence remained fluid, layered, and negotiated. The old world continued to operate through overlap rather than separation. When we imagine borders today, we often picture clear edges, lines that separate one place from another. But before borders became fixed, the spaces between centers of power were not empty or undefined. They were frontiers. A frontier was not a boundary. It was a zone. A wide, flexible area where different groups met, interacted, traded, and sometimes clashed. These regions were often the most dynamic parts of the old world, not its edges. Frontiers existed between empires, kingdoms, and city-states, but they did not function as walls. People moved through them regularly. Traders crossed them to reach new markets. Migrants settled temporarily or permanently. Cultures blended over generations. Because authority weakened with distance, frontiers developed their own systems. Local leaders emerged. Customary laws replaced centralized control. People learned how to navigate multiple power structures at once. Loyalty was often situational rather than absolute. These regions were economically important. Frontier markets connected distant trade networks. Goods moved from one system into another, adapting along the way. Ideas traveled just as easily. New technologies, farming methods, and beliefs often appeared first in frontier zones before spreading inward. Frontiers were also culturally creative spaces. Languages mixed. Clothing styles blended. Religious practices adapted. What later societies would label as foreign or outsider often originated in these zones of contact. Importantly, frontiers were not lawless. They were governed differently. Order existed, but it was negotiated rather than imposed. Stability depended on relationships, reputation, and adaptability rather than enforcement. As borders hardened, many frontier regions lost this flexibility. Zones became lines. Interaction slowed. Cultural blending decreased. What had once been spaces of connection became points of separation. Understanding frontiers helps us see the old world clearly. It was not divided into neat units with empty space between them. It was filled with overlapping zones of life, movement, and exchange. When people imagine empires, they often picture walls, massive structures separating inside from outside. In reality, most ancient empires functioned without continuous physical borders. Walls were rare, expensive, and difficult to maintain. Influence did not rely on barriers, but on presence. The Roman Empire is often misunderstood in this way. While famous walls existed in specific locations, such as Hadrian's Wall, these were exceptions, not the rule. Most of Rome's territory had no physical boundary at all. Roman authority was visible through roads, cities, and administrative centers, not fences. Control worked through nodes, not edges. Cities served as anchors of power. From these centers, law, taxation, and military organization extended outward. Beyond them, influence faded naturally. There was no sudden moment where Roman space ended. Instead, there was a gradual shift from structured administration to local autonomy. Other empires followed similar patterns. In Persia, control was maintained through satrapies, regional administrations responsible for taxation and order. These regions were connected by roads and communication systems, not by walls. Loyalty was ensured through cooperation, not enclosure. Even in places where walls existed, they rarely functioned as absolute barriers. They marked zones of heightened attention rather than sealed borders. Movement continued through gates, paths, and informal crossings. Walls symbolized authority more than they enforced separation. Building and maintaining walls required enormous resources. Most states preferred to invest in infrastructure that enabled movement, roads, ports, storage facilities, because these sustained economies and military response. Stopping movement was rarely practical. Empires without walls were flexible. They could expand and contract without redefining boundaries. This adaptability allowed them to survive changing conditions. Power adjusted to reality rather than forcing reality to conform to rigid lines. The absence of walls did not mean the absence of order. It meant that order was achieved through integration, not exclusion. Understanding this helps explain how vast territories were governed long before borders became fixed. Even after borders began appearing on maps, they often failed to function as intended. Lines drawn by rulers and administrators did not automatically reshape reality on the ground. For long periods of history, borders existed on paper but not in daily life. One reason was enforcement. Early states lacked the manpower and infrastructure to monitor long stretches of land. Guards could be placed near cities, ports, or major roads, but vast rural areas remained open. Farmers, herders, and local traders continued moving as they always had, largely unaffected by newly imagined divisions. Another reason was habit. People followed routes that had existed for generations. A road that connected two markets did not disappear because a line appeared on a map. Traders crossed these routes out of necessity. Local authorities often tolerated this movement because restricting it would damage regional economies. Geography also undermined borders. Rivers shifted course. Forests expanded and receded. Mountain passes changed with seasons. Fixed lines could not adapt easily to a landscape in constant motion. In many regions, natural features mattered more than political definitions. In some cases, borders were deliberately ignored. Local elites negotiated arrangements that allowed continued movement. Taxes were collected informally. Authority was exercised through cooperation rather than enforcement. The priority was stability, not precision. Historical records reveal repeated attempts to redraw boundaries after realizing they were ineffective. Borders moved, overlapped, or were abandoned entirely. This instability shows that borders were not self-sustaining structures. They required continuous effort to maintain, effort that many states could not afford. For ordinary people, this meant that life often continued in familiar patterns despite political changes. Identity, trade, and daily routines adapted slowly. The map changed faster than reality. These failures highlight a key truth: borders only work when society agrees to recognize them. Before that recognition became widespread, borders remained fragile ideas struggling to impose order on deeply rooted systems of movement and connection. Understanding this gap between intention and reality helps explain why the transition from a borderless world to a bordered one took centuries. It was not a single moment, but a long negotiation between power and practice. Long before borders were used to define identity, they were used to control resources. Land, water, minerals, and trade routes mattered more than lines on a map. Borders emerged not to separate people, but to manage access. In the ancient world, fertile land was power. Rivers such as the Nile, Tigris, Euphrates, and Indus supported entire civilizations. Control over these regions meant control over food production, taxation, and population stability. Early boundaries often followed natural features because they marked where resource management changed. Trade routes were equally important. Salt, metals, grain, spices, and textiles moved along established paths. States sought to secure key points along these routes: ports, river crossings, mountain passes. Borders were placed where goods could be monitored, taxed, or protected. This explains why many early borders look irregular. They were shaped by practicality rather than geometry. A boundary might curve to include a quarry, follow a riverbank, or cut across open land to reach a strategic hill or harbor. Control did not always mean exclusion. In many cases, borders regulated flow rather than stopping it. Merchants were allowed to pass, but under supervision. Goods moved freely, but profits were extracted. Borders functioned as filters, not walls. Resource-based borders also shifted frequently. When a river changed course or a mine was depleted, the value of a region changed. Borders moved with them. This flexibility contrasts sharply with modern borders, which aim for permanence regardless of environmental change. For ordinary people, resource control affected daily life more than identity. Farmers adjusted to new tax systems. Fishermen adapted to changing access rules. Traders learned where tolls were collected. Borders mattered because they altered economic behavior, not because they redefined who people were. Understanding borders through resources reveals their original purpose. They were tools of management before they became symbols of separation. This practical foundation explains why borders took centuries to become rigid. They were never meant to be fixed in the first place. At a certain point in history, control over resources began to shape more than economies. It started to shape identity. What people produced, traded, or protected slowly became part of who they were, and how others saw them. Regions known for grain production were associated with stability and order. Areas rich in metals gained reputations tied to craftsmanship and military strength. Coastal communities became identified with trade and navigation. These associations were not symbolic at first, they were practical. Over time, they hardened into cultural labels. As states expanded, administrators categorized regions based on what they provided. Tax systems reflected this logic. One area supplied grain, another timber, another soldiers. Borders began to form around these functional distinctions. A region was no longer just a place, it was a role within a larger system. This process changed how people understood belonging. Loyalty became linked to contribution. If a region fed the empire, defended it, or enriched it, its identity gained meaning within that structure. Identity became tied to economic function rather than ancestry alone. Written records reinforced this shift. Ancient texts increasingly describe regions by their outputs. Maps emphasize ports, mines, and farmlands. Administrative documents define populations through occupation and production. Over time, these descriptions shaped perception. Importantly, this was not imposed overnight. Local identities persisted, but they were gradually layered with broader classifications. A person could be a farmer of a valley, a subject of a ruler, and a member of a productive region all at once. As borders solidified, these identities became more rigid. What had once been flexible roles hardened into expectations. Regions were expected to behave in certain ways because of what they produced. Deviation became difficult. This transformation marks a critical moment. Borders stopped being tools of management and became tools of definition. They did not just regulate resources, they categorized people. Understanding this shift helps explain why modern borders feel tied to identity. That connection was built slowly, through economic roles long before political nationalism emerged. As societies grew larger, identity could no longer rely solely on tradition or local memory. States needed systems to classify, record, and manage people across wide territories. This necessity gave rise to what can be called administrative identity, a form of belonging defined not by culture alone, but by documentation and governance. Administrative identity emerged through lists, records, and categories. People were counted, taxed, assigned duties, and registered within specific regions. These regions were not abstract, they were units of administration. Borders began to appear not as cultural divisions, but as organizational tools. Censuses played a critical role. Knowing how many people lived in a region determined how much tax could be collected and how many soldiers could be raised. To count effectively, administrators needed clarity. Regions had to be defined. Boundaries became practical solutions to bureaucratic problems. Legal systems reinforced this structure. Laws were applied within designated areas. Courts operated within jurisdictions. A person's rights and obligations depended increasingly on where they were registered, not just where they lived. This shift quietly reshaped identity. Maps evolved alongside administration. Earlier maps emphasized routes and landmarks. Newer ones highlighted regions, districts, and controlled zones. These visual representations trained people to think in terms of enclosed spaces rather than fluid landscapes. Over time, administrative identity gained permanence. What began as a tool for management became a framework for belonging. People identified themselves through the systems that governed them. Being part of a region meant being part of its rules, taxes, and protections. This process did not eliminate older identities, but it layered over them. Local customs survived, yet administrative labels increasingly determined how individuals interacted with power. Identity became legible to the state. The rise of administrative identity marks a turning point. Borders were no longer optional or flexible. They became embedded in paperwork, law, and governance. Once identity could be written down, borders became difficult to erase. This development set the stage for a world where borders would eventually feel natural, even inevitable, despite their relatively recent origins. There came a point when borders stopped moving easily. What had once been flexible zones of influence began to harden into fixed divisions. This change did not happen because borders suddenly worked better, but because states learned how to enforce permanence. The key factor was infrastructure. Roads became standardized. Checkpoints appeared at strategic locations. Administrative centers multiplied. Communication improved. Power could now travel faster than before, allowing authorities to monitor and respond across larger territories. Borders no longer relied on proximity alone. Law played a decisive role. Legal systems began tying land ownership, taxation, and legal responsibility to specific territories. Once land could be owned, transferred, and taxed within defined limits, borders gained economic weight. Crossing a boundary was no longer just movement, it meant entering a different legal reality. Military organization reinforced this permanence. Standing armies replaced temporary forces. Garrisons were stationed along strategic regions. Control became continuous rather than reactive. Borders were defended not because they were sacred, but because they structured security. Time also mattered. As generations grew up under the same divisions, borders became familiar. What was once negotiable turned into tradition. People adapted their lives to these divisions. Trade routes adjusted. Local identities aligned with administrative regions. Importantly, permanence did not mean absolute stability. Borders still shifted through war, diplomacy, and collapse. But the expectation changed. Borders were now assumed to exist unless disrupted. The default was permanence, not flexibility. This shift altered how people imagined the world. Space became segmented. Belonging became territorial. Authority became visible through boundaries. The idea that land could be divided, owned, and governed permanently took hold. Once borders reached this stage, reversing them became difficult. Removing a border required dismantling systems, laws, and habits built around it. Borders had moved from maps into everyday life. This transformation marks a defining moment in human history. It explains why modern borders feel ancient, even though most are not. Their permanence is the result of systems layered over centuries, not an original condition of the world. Once borders became permanent, they evolved into instruments of power. They were no longer passive divisions, they actively shaped who could move, trade, settle, and govern. Borders became tools through which authority was exercised and displayed. Power expressed itself spatially. Control over territory meant control over people within it. Borders allowed rulers to define the limits of their reach, making authority measurable and enforceable. Taxation, military service, and legal jurisdiction all depended on knowing where control began and ended. This relationship transformed governance. States could now plan long-term. Resources could be allocated with precision. Infrastructure projects were designed to strengthen internal cohesion and regulate access from outside. Borders made power predictable. Borders also enabled exclusion. While earlier systems focused on regulating flow, permanent borders made it possible to restrict movement entirely. Access became conditional. Permission replaced tradition. The ability to say, inside and outside, created new hierarchies of belonging. Symbols reinforced this control. Markers, seals, gates, and official documents made borders visible even when physical barriers were minimal. Authority was communicated through signs as much as through force. The border became a message: power exists here. Importantly, borders concentrated power at the center. Decisions made far away now applied uniformly across defined territories. Local autonomy diminished as centralized control expanded. Borders allowed rulers to govern people they would never meet. This centralization was not always stable. Resistance emerged where borders conflicted with lived reality. Smuggling, informal crossings, and parallel systems developed. These practices reveal that borders were effective but never absolute. Despite this tension, borders fundamentally changed how power operated. They transformed authority from a network of relationships into a spatial system. Control became tied to land rather than loyalty alone. Understanding borders as tools of power explains why they provoke conflict. Borders define access to land, resources, and rights. Where access is controlled, power follows. This dynamic continues today, but its roots lie in this historical shift, when borders stopped being lines of convenience and became engines of control. As borders became instruments of control, people adapted. They did not always resist openly, but they learned how to live around borders rather than within them. This quiet adaptation shaped daily life in ways official records rarely capture. Smuggling was not initially a crime in the moral sense. It was often a response to sudden restrictions imposed on long-standing practices. When trade routes were divided by new borders, local economies did not simply disappear. They adjusted. Goods continued to move through informal paths, family connections, and trusted networks. These parallel systems thrived in border regions. People who understood the land, its forests, rivers, and mountains, became essential intermediaries. Knowledge replaced force. Familiarity with terrain allowed movement to continue despite official controls. Resistance was rarely dramatic. It took the form of avoidance, negotiation, and quiet defiance. Taxes were underreported. Goods were misclassified. Borders were crossed at night or during seasonal changes when surveillance weakened. These acts were practical, not ideological. Over time, entire communities developed identities shaped by this in-between existence. They were neither fully inside nor fully outside. Their loyalty was to survival and continuity rather than abstract authority. Borders created margins, and margins created culture. Authorities were aware of these practices. In many cases, they tolerated them. Enforcement was costly, and total control was unrealistic. Informal systems provided stability where rigid rules would have caused collapse. This uneasy balance defined border life for centuries. These spaces between borders became zones of innovation. New trade methods emerged. Cultural blending accelerated. Language and customs adapted quickly. What official borders attempted to separate, daily life quietly reconnected. This pattern reveals an essential truth: borders shape behavior, but they do not eliminate agency. People respond creatively to constraint. The history of borders is not only the history of control, but also the history of adaptation. Understanding life between borders shows how human systems remain resilient even when structures harden. Borders may define power, but they never fully define life. For most of human history, borders simply did not exist in the way we understand them today. This was not because people lacked conflict or organization, but because they lacked the tools required to define space precisely. Early societies did not think in terms of fixed territory. They thought in terms of access to water, land, pasture, trade routes, and seasonal movement. Control was personal and relational, not spatial. Authority followed people, not lines. One of the main reasons borders appeared so late was technological limitation. Without accurate measurement, consistent mapping, and written administration, defining exact boundaries was nearly impossible. Land could be described, but not precisely divided. Writing changed this. Once information could be recorded, stored, and copied, territory became legible. Lists of land, people, and resources could be maintained. Ownership could be documented. Borders began as descriptions, not barriers. Mapping accelerated the process. Early maps were symbolic and functional, showing routes, landmarks, and relative distances. Over time, maps became abstract representations of space. When rulers began trusting maps more than local knowledge, borders moved from the landscape into the imagination. Measurement was equally important. The ability to survey land accurately allowed states to divide space consistently. Geometry replaced memory. This shift transformed land from a shared environment into a controlled asset. Another factor was scale. Small societies did not need borders. Everyone knew where influence ended. As states expanded, personal knowledge failed. Borders emerged as solutions to complexity, not as expressions of identity. Crucially, borders were not born out of cultural separation. They emerged from administrative necessity. States needed to know where taxation applied, where laws held authority, and where responsibility began and ended. This explains why borders appear unevenly in history. They arrive when writing, mapping, measurement, and centralized administration converge. Without these systems, borders could not exist in a durable form. Borders are often treated as ancient and natural. In reality, they are late inventions, products of technology, bureaucracy, and abstraction layered over a world that once operated without them. Before borders were enforced on the ground, they were first enforced on paper. Long before armies guarded lines, maps defined them. This reversal is often overlooked, but it explains why borders could exist even where physical control was weak. Early maps were not neutral tools. They reflected how rulers wanted space to be understood. By selecting what to include, what to exaggerate, and what to ignore, maps shaped political reality. A line drawn by a cartographer could claim land that had never been physically controlled. Once a region appeared on a map as part of a territory, it gained legitimacy. Maps transformed abstract claims into visible facts. Over time, repeated use of these maps trained administrators, soldiers, and citizens to accept borders as real. This process gave states a powerful advantage. A border on a map could be referenced in treaties, laws, and negotiations even if no wall or guard existed. Armies were often sent later to enforce what had already been drawn. Standardization intensified this effect. As map-making became more precise and consistent, borders gained a sense of permanence. Reproduced maps spread identical spatial ideas across vast populations. People learned where they supposedly belonged by seeing it printed. Maps also simplified complexity. Fluid regions were reduced to clear shapes. Overlapping influence disappeared behind clean lines. This visual clarity made governance easier, but it distorted reality. Borders looked stable even when they were contested or ignored in practice. Importantly, maps did not reflect how people experienced space. Local movement, trade, and identity often contradicted cartographic boundaries. But once maps entered bureaucratic systems, they carried authority that daily life could not easily challenge. This explains why modern conflicts often revolve around maps rather than lived experience. Borders that appear ancient are sometimes younger than the documents that enforce them. In many cases, maps created borders that reality was later forced to obey. Understanding this reveals how power operated through representation long before physical domination followed. Borders did not begin with soldiers. They began with ink. Medieval people did not understand the world through borders because their lives were not organized that way. The idea of belonging to a clearly defined territorial unit was largely absent from everyday thought. Identity was shaped by relationships, obligations, and proximity, not by abstract lines. For most people, the world extended only as far as they could travel or recognize. Villages, towns, churches, markets, and local authorities defined reality. Beyond that, space became unfamiliar, not foreign. There was no mental map of fixed national territory. Loyalty was personal rather than territorial. People owed allegiance to a lord, a bishop, a city, or a ruler, not to land enclosed by borders. These relationships overlapped. A person could be subject to multiple authorities at once without contradiction. Legal systems reinforced this worldview. Laws applied based on status and affiliation, not geography. Jurisdiction followed people rather than land. Crossing into another region did not necessarily mean entering a different legal identity. Travel further reveals this mindset. Merchants, pilgrims, and messengers moved across vast distances with little awareness of borders. What mattered were tolls, safe passages, and local customs, not abstract divisions. Movement was regulated by networks, not boundaries. Even warfare reflects this logic. Conflicts focused on cities, castles, and routes, not borderlines. Territory mattered because of what it contained, not because of where it ended. Control was exercised through occupation, not enclosure. Maps of the medieval period support this understanding. They emphasized symbolic order rather than spatial accuracy. Sacred centers, routes, and landmarks dominated representation. Borders, when present, were vague and secondary. This worldview made borders unnecessary. People navigated life through familiarity and obligation. Space was experienced, not measured. Only later, as administration, mapping, and centralized power expanded, did this mindset change. Medieval people did not ignore borders. Borders simply did not exist in a form meaningful to them. Understanding this difference helps explain why borders required centuries to take hold. They demanded a new way of thinking about space, one that medieval society did not yet possess. The moment the world was first printed on paper, it quietly changed how power understood space. Before printed maps, geography lived in memory, experience, and oral knowledge. Maps existed, but they were rare, symbolic, and handcrafted. This changed dramatically in the 15th century, when printing technology allowed maps to be reproduced and distributed widely for the first time. One of the most influential early printed world maps was produced in 1477 in Bologna, based on the work of the ancient geographer Claudius Ptolemy. Although Ptolemy had lived more than 1,000 years earlier, the printing press revived his ideas and gave them new authority. For the first time, a consistent image of the world could be shared across cities, courts, and administrations. This was revolutionary. Printed maps did not just describe the world, they standardized it. Regions appeared fixed. Shapes repeated. Space became something that could be referenced, compared, and governed from afar. Authority no longer depended solely on local knowledge, it could rely on paper. As maps spread, rulers began to think differently about control. If land could be clearly represented, it could be managed. This logic soon extended from territory to people. The earliest forms of passports did not begin as tools of national identity. They were letters of safe conduct. In medieval Europe, rulers and city authorities issued documents allowing individuals to pass safely through specific areas. These papers described who the person was, where they were allowed to go, and under whose protection they traveled. The word passport itself comes from the idea of passing through a gate, not crossing a national border. These documents were practical tools, not symbols of citizenship. They protected merchants, messengers, and diplomats in a world where movement was still relatively free. However, as borders became more defined, these documents changed in meaning. Movement began to require permission. Identity started to be verified. What had once been an exception slowly became a rule. The public response was mixed. For centuries, people were accustomed to traveling based on local customs and recognition. The idea that movement could be restricted by paperwork felt unnatural. Many resisted quietly, ignored regulations, or relied on informal networks to move as they always had. Yet over time, people adapted. Documents became part of daily life. Authority shifted from personal recognition to written verification. Identity moved from memory into records. The printed map and the early passport together marked a turning point. Space was no longer just lived, it was administered. Movement was no longer assumed, it was regulated. This was not the world as it had always been. It was the beginning of something new. As borders hardened, identity slowly detached from memory and community and moved onto paper. What had once been known through face, reputation, and belonging became something that needed to be recorded, verified, and stored. In earlier societies, identity was relational. A person was known through family ties, profession, religious affiliation, or loyalty to a local authority. Recognition came from others, not from documents. This system worked in small, interconnected worlds. Borders disrupted this logic. Once movement and authority depended on territory, states needed a way to determine who belonged where. Personal recognition no longer scaled. Paper did. Registers, tax records, land lists, and travel documents began defining individuals in administrative terms. A person became a name attached to a place. Identity was no longer only who you were, but where you were recorded. This shift was subtle but transformative. Paper allowed identity to persist beyond presence. Officials who had never met someone could still judge them based on records. Authority no longer required familiarity, only documentation. Over time, these records gained legitimacy. They became trusted more than personal testimony. A written document could override memory, reputation, or local knowledge. Identity became portable, but also fragile. Lose the paper, and you could lose recognition. Borders accelerated this process by demanding clarity. States needed to know who could be taxed, conscripted, protected, or excluded. Paper identity provided answers. It standardized belonging. Importantly, this was not initially about nationality. It was about administration. Identity became legible to power. Once legible, it could be controlled. This transformation changed how people understood themselves. Identity shifted from something lived to something proven. Belonging became conditional. The border did not just divide land, it divided recognition. By the time modern states emerged, identity on paper felt natural. But this was a learned condition. For most of history, identity did not exist in files or archives. Borders put it there. For most of human history, movement was assumed. People traveled for trade, work, pilgrimage, or survival without needing permission. Borders changed this assumption. As documentation became standard, movement began to require approval. What was once normal became conditional. Travel shifted from a right of existence to a privilege granted by authority. This change did not happen all at once. It began in sensitive regions, border zones, strategic cities, and trade hubs. Merchants and messengers were the first to face restrictions. Gradually, these rules expanded to include ordinary people. Movement became something that needed justification. Purpose mattered. Destination mattered. Identity mattered. Without proper documents, movement could be delayed, denied, or punished. This redefinition altered daily life. Travel planning now involved bureaucracy. Routes were chosen based on regulation rather than convenience. Fear of inspection became common. States benefited from this control. Regulating movement allowed authorities to manage labor, prevent desertion, collect taxes, and enforce order. Borders became filters rather than lines. The psychological impact was profound. People internalized restriction. Movement was no longer spontaneous. It became something to be requested, proven, and monitored. Over generations, this new reality normalized itself. Children grew up learning where they could go and why. The idea that movement required permission became common sense. What had once felt unnatural slowly felt inevitable. Borders did not just restrict movement physically, they reshaped expectations. By the time modern border regimes formed, movement without documents seemed unthinkable. A privilege had replaced a condition of life. Modern citizenship did not emerge from ancient tradition. It emerged from borders, paperwork, and administration. Citizenship was the final step in transforming identity into a legal category. Once states controlled territory, movement, and documentation, they needed a stable way to define who belonged permanently. Citizenship answered this need. It linked individuals to a state through law rather than loyalty. Citizenship formalized rights and obligations. Protection, taxation, military service, and legal recognition became conditional on membership. Borders defined the space. Citizenship defined the people within it. This concept reshaped identity. Belonging was no longer flexible. It became exclusive. You were inside or outside. Rights were distributed accordingly. Unlike earlier systems, citizenship was designed to persist. It followed individuals across generations. Identity became inherited, not negotiated. Paper replaced relationships. The state gained unprecedented power. It could include or exclude, grant or revoke. Identity became enforceable. For individuals, citizenship brought security and limitation at the same time. Protection came with restriction. Belonging came with control. This system felt natural only because it developed gradually. Each step, borders, documents, movement control, prepared society to accept citizenship as normal. But citizenship is not ancient. It is modern. It is the product of centuries of administrative evolution layered over a world that once had none of these categories. Understanding this reveals how deeply borders have reshaped human life. They did not just divide land. They redefined who people are. Once borders, documents, and citizenship were established, they created a powerful illusion, the illusion of order. From a distance, the world appeared neatly organized, territories defined, populations categorized, authority clearly assigned. But this order was largely administrative, not lived. Borders promised clarity. They suggested that chaos could be managed by drawing lines, that complexity could be reduced to structure. On maps and in records, this seemed to work. Territories were named. Jurisdictions were outlined. People were assigned legal identities. In reality, life remained far messier. Local customs often conflicted with centralized rules. Economic activity ignored official divisions when survival depended on flexibility. Languages, traditions, and loyalties continued to overlap across borders that appeared firm on paper. States responded by reinforcing the image of order. More records were created. More documents issued. Maps became more detailed. Borders were emphasized visually and legally, even when enforcement was inconsistent. This gap between appearance and reality became a defining feature of the modern world. Borders did not eliminate disorder, they reframed it. Problems that once existed openly now existed within systems. Conflict moved from open negotiation to legal disputes. Movement shifted from tradition to permission. The illusion of order also shaped expectations. People began to believe that borders naturally produced stability. When disorder appeared, it was seen as a failure rather than a constant condition of human society. Importantly, this illusion was useful. It allowed states to function at scale. It made administration possible. But it also hid complexity. Borders simplified the world for those in power, not necessarily for those living within it. Understanding borders as an illusion of order does not mean they are meaningless. It means their power lies in perception as much as enforcement. They organize how we think about space, authority, and belonging. The world did not become orderly because borders appeared. Borders appeared because the world was already complex, and power needed a way to manage that complexity. When borders became normal, the change did not arrive with noise or announcement. It settled quietly into everyday life, altering how people related to space, movement, and each other. What was lost was not immediately visible, but over time it reshaped the human experience in fundamental ways. Before borders hardened, the world was understood as a continuous landscape. Roads did not belong to states, they belonged to use. Rivers connected rather than separated. Mountains slowed movement but did not define exclusion. Space was experienced through travel, trade, and memory, not through classification. Borders interrupted this continuity. They introduced the idea that space could be segmented permanently. Routes that once adapted naturally now required approval. Paths that had existed for generations could be redefined overnight as illegal or foreign. This shift weakened informal systems that had governed life for centuries. Trust-based networks, local agreements, and shared customs lost authority when confronted with centralized rules. Where recognition once came from familiarity, it now came from documentation. Belonging became conditional. Cultural exchange changed as well. Ideas still traveled, but less freely. Interaction became regulated. Languages stabilized instead of blending. Traditions hardened instead of adapting. Difference began to feel distant rather than navigable. Economically, borders reshaped opportunity. Markets that once flowed organically became fragmented. Trade survived, but it became procedural. Flexibility gave way to compliance. Efficiency replaced resilience. Psychologically, borders narrowed perception. People began to imagine the world as a series of contained units rather than a connected whole. Elsewhere no longer meant distant, it meant restricted. Curiosity gave way to caution. Importantly, this loss was not experienced equally. Those in power gained clarity and control. For ordinary people, the world became smaller, not physically, but mentally. Options narrowed. Movement became deliberate rather than instinctive. This was not progress or decline in a simple sense. It was a transformation. Borders created order, but they also erased ambiguity. They reduced uncertainty, but they also reduced freedom of adaptation. What was lost was not the ability to move entirely, but the assumption that movement was natural. Space became something to navigate carefully rather than inhabit freely. Understanding this loss is essential. It explains why borders feel both necessary and restrictive. They solved problems, but they also replaced an older way of living with space, one built on continuity rather than division. The world did not become better or worse when borders became normal. It became different. Borders feel ancient because they have been repeated, taught, and reinforced for generations. Familiarity creates the illusion of permanence. When something surrounds us from birth, it appears timeless, even when it is not. Most modern borders are surprisingly recent. Many are younger than the cities they divide, younger than the roads that cross them, and far younger than the cultures they claim to separate. Yet because they are taught as fixed facts, they feel inevitable. This illusion was carefully constructed. Once borders became administrative realities, states worked to anchor them in history. Maps were redrawn to suggest continuity. Textbooks framed borders as natural outcomes rather than political decisions. Legal systems treated them as foundational truths. Repetition did the rest. Each generation inherited the same lines, the same names, the same divisions. Over time, borders stopped feeling like agreements and began to feel like facts of nature. Questioning them seemed unnecessary, even dangerous. But historical evidence tells a different story. Old maps reveal constant movement. Borders shift, disappear, reappear, and overlap. Regions once united become separated, others merge unexpectedly. The past is not stable, only our presentation of it is. Borders gain their ancient aura not through age, but through institutional memory. Schools, laws, records, and ceremonies reinforce them daily. The border became something learned before it was understood. Psychologically, this matters. Humans trust what appears permanent. When borders look old, they feel legitimate. They stop being seen as choices and start being seen as destiny. This perception hides the truth: borders are tools, not truths. They are outcomes of negotiation, conflict, and administration. They persist because systems support them, not because they are natural. Understanding this difference changes how we interpret history. It reveals that many conflicts are not ancient hatreds, but modern problems framed as old ones. Borders create stories about the past that justify the present. Borders feel ancient because forgetting is powerful. Forgetting how often they changed. Forgetting why they were drawn. Forgetting that alternatives once existed. The illusion of age gives borders authority. But authority does not equal inevitability. It only means the system has lasted long enough to feel unquestionable. Recognizing this does not mean rejecting borders. It means seeing them clearly, not as relics of the distant past, but as products of relatively recent human decisions. For a long time, borders existed mostly on paper. They were declared, named, and debated, but they did not truly function in everyday life. Authority imagined clear divisions long before it could enforce them. In early modern history, a border often meant little more than a vague idea. Lines drawn by rulers rarely matched the realities of terrain, travel, or local custom. Maps claimed certainty, but the land itself resisted precision. Villages near borders lived ambiguously. People traded across lines they barely recognized. Farmers worked fields that technically belonged elsewhere. Travelers moved without documents because none yet existed to demand them. Enforcement was weak because infrastructure was weak. States lacked roads, communication systems, and personnel to monitor boundaries consistently. Distance diluted authority. Orders took weeks or months to arrive, if they arrived at all. Local power mattered more than central power. A town council, a landowner, or a regional lord often mattered more than a distant capital. Borders were negotiated daily rather than imposed absolutely. This gap between intention and reality defined much of the early bordered world. States claimed control, but practice lagged behind ambition. Borders were asserted symbolically before they could be enforced materially. This period created a strange duality. Officially, the world was divided. Practically, it remained connected. People learned to live within this contradiction. Smugglers thrived not because they were criminals, but because rules were unclear. Merchants adapted by ignoring boundaries when possible and respecting them when necessary. Borders were flexible because survival demanded flexibility. The absence of strict enforcement also meant identity remained fluid. A person might belong to one authority today and another tomorrow. Allegiance shifted with opportunity, safety, or trade. This world was not chaotic. It operated on informal logic rather than legal rigidity. Relationships mattered more than paperwork. Reputation mattered more than registration. Borders during this phase were aspirations, not realities. They represented what states wanted, not what they controlled. Only later, when technology, bureaucracy, and coercion aligned, would borders become fixed experiences rather than distant ideas. Understanding this stage is crucial. It explains why borders did not instantly reshape human life. Change was gradual. The old world did not disappear overnight, it faded slowly as systems strengthened. For centuries, people lived between claims and realities. And in that space, movement remained possible. Borders did not become powerful because rulers declared them so. They became powerful when states finally acquired the tools to enforce them. What changed the world was not intention, but capacity. For centuries, borders had existed as ideas. Now they became systems. This transformation occurred gradually, driven by three forces working together: infrastructure, bureaucracy, and coercion. Alone, none was sufficient. Together, they reshaped human movement. Roads improved. Travel became faster and more predictable. States could reach their edges more consistently. Messages that once took weeks now arrived in days. Authority stopped fading with distance. At the same time, record-keeping expanded. Populations were counted. Names were written down. Births, deaths, taxes, and residences were documented. Identity began to exist not only in memory, but in archives. Paper became power. The introduction of standardized documents changed everything. Movement was no longer assumed, it was verified. A person's legitimacy depended on what could be proven, not merely who they were known to be. Borders began to function not just as lines, but as filters. They sorted, delayed, questioned, and denied. For the first time, large populations experienced restriction as routine. Enforcement followed. States invested in personnel whose sole purpose was oversight. Border officials, inspectors, and patrols appeared. Authority became visible at the edges. This did not happen everywhere at once. Some regions resisted longer. Others adapted quickly. But the direction was clear: borders were becoming real experiences rather than abstract claims. The effect on daily life was profound. Travel required planning. Trade required documentation. Belonging required proof. People adjusted. Some complied. Others avoided. Entire informal economies emerged around navigating these new systems. Smuggling was no longer just opportunity, it was adaptation. Identity hardened under pressure. When movement is controlled, affiliation becomes valuable. People learn to define themselves more narrowly, aligning with the categories that granted access. Borders reshaped trust. Strangers became risks. Officials replaced neighbors as arbiters of legitimacy. This moment marked a turning point. The world did not become static, but it became regulated. Movement continued, but it was no longer neutral. It carried consequence. Borders finally took hold not because humans accepted them, but because systems made them unavoidable. From this point forward, the bordered world was no longer theoretical. It was lived. Once borders became enforceable, their most powerful effect was not physical but mental. They did more than control movement, they reshaped how humans imagined the world, themselves, and others. Before borders became dominant, people thought in terms of routes rather than destinations. Travel was understood as a process, not a permission. Identity was situational, shaped by trade, language, family, and experience rather than fixed categories. Borders introduced a different logic. Space was no longer continuous, it was compartmentalized. The world became something to navigate through rules rather than relationships. Maps reinforced this shift. Earlier maps emphasized geography, rivers, roads, terrain. Modern maps emphasize division. Lines became more important than landscapes. The map stopped describing the world and began instructing how to move through it. This changed perception. People stopped imagining the land beyond the border as simply further. It became foreign. Distance was replaced by difference. Identity followed the same pattern. Belonging hardened. Labels mattered more. Where you were from became more important than where you had been. Citizenship replaced familiarity. Documentation replaced reputation. This mental restructuring affected trust. In the old world, strangers were evaluated gradually, through language, behavior, and shared customs. In the bordered world, strangers were classified immediately. Paper decided first impressions. Borders also reshaped time. Movement slowed mentally even when it sped up physically. Planning replaced spontaneity. Risk replaced curiosity. The unknown became something to avoid rather than explore. Generations grew up internalizing this logic. Children learned borders before they understood geography. Lines came before landscapes. Rules came before experience. Over time, people stopped seeing borders as limits imposed from outside and began experiencing them as natural boundaries. The idea that the world could be otherwise became difficult to imagine. This was not enforced through fear alone. It was normalized through routine. Every document check, every map, every lesson reinforced the same message: the world is divided, and this division is normal. Borders did not eliminate curiosity, but they redirected it. Exploration became official. Discovery required authorization. Movement became exceptional instead of expected. The greatest transformation was subtle. People began to define themselves less by movement and more by containment. Identity became anchored to place rather than shaped by journey. This shift did not remove human adaptability. It redirected it inward. People learned to navigate systems rather than landscapes. To manage paperwork rather than pathways. Understanding this mental change explains why borders feel inevitable today. They are not just lines on land, they are lines in thought. And once something lives in thought, it becomes far harder to challenge. Borders feel permanent because they are reinforced every day. They are taught, documented, enforced, and repeated until they fade into the background of ordinary life. Yet beneath every modern border lies a much older reality, one that has never fully disappeared. The world did not begin with borders. It existed long before lines were drawn, long before movement required permission, long before identity could be reduced to paper. For most of human history, connection came first. Division came later. Even after borders became enforceable, they never completely erased older patterns. Roads continued to cross them. Rivers ignored them. Mountains remained indifferent. Trade adapted. Families stretched across lines. Languages carried memory further than any boundary could reach. Borders reorganized life, but they did not replace geography. They altered how humans interacted with space, but they did not change the space itself. The land did not become divided, only its administration did. This distinction matters. It explains why borders often feel artificial even when they are powerful. Why they require constant reinforcement. Why they must be taught again and again to remain real. The older world still exists beneath them, in shared customs, in overlapping cultures, in routes that predate control. It survives in the ease with which humans adapt when borders loosen, and in the friction that appears when they tighten. History shows that borders are not endpoints. They are phases. They emerge, solidify, weaken, and sometimes disappear. Empires fall. States dissolve. Lines shift or vanish. The land remains. Understanding this does not mean rejecting borders. It means recognizing them for what they are, tools created to solve specific problems in specific moments. Useful, powerful, but not eternal. The danger comes when borders are mistaken for nature. When lines are treated as destiny rather than design. When division is assumed to be the default state of the world. The old world before borders was not perfect. It was uncertain, uneven, and often dangerous. But it was dynamic. It allowed for adaptation. It relied on relationship rather than restriction. The modern world gained stability through borders. But it also lost fluidity. It traded continuity for control. Today, we live with both worlds layered together. We follow rules drawn on paper while walking landscapes shaped by history far older than any state. We carry identities defined by documents while speaking languages formed through centuries of exchange. Borders may organize the surface of our world, but beneath them, the deeper structure remains connected. And remembering this matters, not to erase borders, but to understand them. To see that the world was once shared more freely, and that this memory still shapes how humans move, trade, speak, and imagine beyond the lines. The world before borders never truly ended. It simply went quiet.